Hello everyone and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James and on this channel I do reviews of both music and movies along with the occasional commentary piece, so if any of that sounds interesting to you then please give this video a like and subscribe to my channel to see future content like that. And today we have another episode of quick music reviews coming to you. This past few months or so has been pretty crazy for music, especially October and even the beginning of November. It's been so busy. And today's episode is going to be a little bit more focused on the metal side of things, / hard rock side of things. There are going to be a couple outliers here and there, but overall, this has been a pretty big month for metal releases for me. There will be an individual album review coming out very soon on a particularly big artist. I'm sure you can probably guess who that big artist is, but there will be an individual album review on that. Today, we have 7 different albums to discuss, all ones that I am fairly interested to talk about for one reason or another. So let's go ahead and get started with the first album I will be discussing. And the first album, which is one of 2 albums on here I'd say that aren't really metal adjacent or popular within that metalcore sphere, is the 1975's newest album, Being Funny in a Foreign Language. Now, I'll be honest, going into this album, I didn't have any particularly high expectations for it, especially coming off of their last 2 decidedly underwhelming albums to me. In general, I've never been like the most gigantic fan of the 1975. I really like specific songs from them, but I think as far as albums go, the 1975 has never been an entirely consistent band. But nevertheless, yeah, I didn't have a lot of crazy expectations for this album, but I was pleasantly surprised by it. Now, this isn't like a mind-blowing release or anything, and I don't think this band is doing anything particularly crazy with their sound, but this is a sort of nice return to the back to the basics sound that they had on their first 2 albums, while still having some of those experimental flourishes of their later albums. And for that reason, I think it will please both fan bases of the 1975, those that enjoy their older sound, as well as those who have actually enjoyed or preferred their newer sound. It also seems that there's a pretty good overall theme in the album, talking about internet culture and trying to find your humanity in the midst of the prevailing social media culture that we have. And of course, this does lead to some commentary about cancel culture as well, which I've said before I'm not a huge fan of, and there are definitely places where that pops up on here, including talking about Matty Healy getting canceled, which I never even knew that he was in danger of being that. Let's talk about the songs on this album. I do think that Happiness is a really strong cut. I like the saxophone in it. It brings back the saxophone that was on If You're Too Shy Then Let Me Know, and I really like what they do with that. And it is sort of an ironic song in a way, being that it's titled about happiness, but it is a decidedly pretty dark song in many ways, but I do like it, and I do like the upbeat feel of it. Looking for Somebody to Love is an interesting track, to say the least. It brings to mind Pump Up Kicks by Foster the People, in that it is a upbeat sounding song, but talking about school shootings, and more specifically toxic masculinity, I would say, in this cut as well, and how people's toxic masculinity or insecurities results in them resorting to violent tendencies. And I like that the band is sort of putting this satirical upbeat sheen on it. I think it does work in this track. Oh, Caroline is also a pretty great cut, which with almost a classic pop rock feel that I really like. And I think All I Need to Hear is a nice change in pace for the 1975. Pretty good, almost rock ballad in a way. It's very different for them, but I appreciate that they are trying something different on this cut. And I think Wintering is a pretty good cut here too. I think it does fit pretty well with the winter season. Now, I will say that there are some cuts that really just don't work for me at all on this release as well. I think Part of the Band is a really bizarre cut that reminds me of their past 2 albums, in that it feels like it's trying to do something different but doesn't really work in what it's trying to do. The orchestration in the song is okay, I guess, but the lyrics just make my eyes roll right up to the ceiling, as they feel like prime pretentiousness to me. And Human to You feels like a very weak apology for Matty Healy apologizing for his past actions. It feels more whiny than anything else. And I get what he's trying to say in the cut, but it feels very disingenuous in the way it's written out. But overall, I do think this is a nice return to form for the 1975 after a couple of albums that just didn't really do much for me at all. I think this is probably the best return to their old sound we'll probably get. I would like to see them push the envelope a little further in terms of what they're doing. But, I mean, I'm fine with this album. It's not like a top release for me or anything, and Happiness has a good chance of being one of my favorite songs of the year, so I can't really complain a whole lot here. It's a fine release and one that I like well enough. I'm just not particularly impressed by it. I'll give this a light 3.5 out of 5 stars. Alright, next, let's talk about one of my most anticipated albums of this year. I have been waiting for this band to come out for something for 5 years now. It's been way too long, but I am so excited to finally be able to talk about a new Nothing More album, and this one is called Spirits. And, wow, the singles got me really hyped up for this album. I mean, Turn It Up Like was a really good song from Nothing More. It was just iconic of their sound. And I really loved just how unpredictable it was. And then Tired of Winning was a really great single as well, with some pretty unique guitar work that almost verged on the metal in some places. I mean, there was this almost breakdown in the song that really caught me by surprise and made me hope that they would be pursuing this more intense guitar work on the album as a whole. And man, were those hopes delivered in spades, because wow, this is another excellent album from Nothing More. It's impressive that they are 3 for 3 on innovative rock albums that do something interesting. And on this one, they clearly have a lot to say. It follows very much in the footsteps of the stories we tell ourselves, and that it is a more politically leaning album, and probably even amps that up even more to be their most intense album to date by a long shot. And for as much as I really like the stories we tell ourselves, even love that album, I think I like this album better. I'm not sure if I like it as much as their second self-titled album, which is still a very unique release to me and one that I just love returning to, but this one comes awfully close. Ships in the Night feels like an interlude of sorts on the album, and I think it actually works better than the interludes on the stories we tell ourselves, because there's some actual musicality going on here too, not just a speech, although I like what the speech is saying too. But I like that it transitions into some more musical passages in the song as well. And I think it works well at transitioning into the next song on the album, You Don't Know What Love Means, which is one of my top 3 on the album for sure. This song is much more personal rather than political. And I really like the sort of devastation that's coming from Johnny's vocals. You can really feel that he's very devastated by this breakup that has happened, and that he's sort of calling out to this person, calling them out, saying that they don't know what love means and how to be in a relationship. There's so many other great songs to compliment on here as well. Face It is an almost 7-minute epic that just blows my mind every time I hear it. It is definitely my favorite song on the album, and it even leans into some gent metalcore territory that I was just not at all ready for. But it works, especially as the song is talking about facing the darker parts of yourselves, and maybe even having to force them out as a result of the world that we are living in. It is a brutally honest song, and Johnny's vocals are just off the charts good. The bass work on this song is great, even better on a song like Deja Vu, where the bass becomes very prominent, and is another more unique type of sound for Nothing More that I've not really heard them do before. It has a very eerie, atmospheric tone to it that prevails throughout the whole song. Dream With Me is just another super energetic cut, maybe even the most intense song on the album, as Johnny's vocals just keep on reaching new heights, and man, that guitar work just goes absolutely insane. It's not often I hear a rock album just going this hard and this intense while still managing somehow to remain accessible for those who do like mainstream rock. For those who were fans of Fade In, Fade Out, you all will really like the beginning parts of Valhalla, as it brings those vibes to the forefront. But I like that it really changes things up later on and doesn't stay with that same vibe, even having a guitar solo that is just so good, and is definitely one of the strongest moments on the album. Even if Valhalla isn't one of my top 3 on the album, I think it is still a very strong cut. And then the album ends on just a huge high note with the title track, Spirits, which seems to be talking about alcohol addiction or in general about how we let certain dark vices take control of our lives. And that is what, as a result, makes us bitter to a lot of other things in the world. I like that Spirits is almost an answer to the first song, Turn It Up Like, and goes for a much more personal feel. This is a nearly pitch perfect album for me. I think the only song that doesn't necessarily work for me is probably Best Times. This one does feel sort of generic, like Who We Are, a sort of like you don't know what you have until it's gone type of song, and it's not terrible by any means, but it does feel sort of basic compared to the rest of the album. But really, that's the only cut here that I can say that I don't love. The other F Word is also a fine song, and I think it has some clever moments, but it is another one that doesn't necessarily stand out to me in the same way that other songs on the album do. But even still, I just do not have a whole lot to complain about here. I think this is a great album with a lot of good things to say, and I think that any rock fan should really enjoy this, especially if you're a rock fan rather, that is looking for something new to enjoy and something innovative, something that does stuff interesting within this soundscape. Nothing more does that in spades. Strong 4.5 out of 5 stars for me. This could very well be my favorite album of the year. It is that good. Alright, let's talk about the new Architects album, The Classic Symptoms of a Broken Spirit. Now, like I said in my review of Architects' album from last year, I was a little surprised by the more mixed reactions that people had to that album, as I thought it was a pretty logical evolution of their sound. And to be honest, I still stand by my rating of that album. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5, and I still stand by that. Maybe even more strongly now that I've heard this album, to be honest. I think it is still a really good evolution of their sound and has a lot of cool ideas in it. But this new album, this really let me down. I hate to say it, but this is by far one of the most disappointing albums I've heard this year, if not the most disappointing, if I'm being honest, because I absolutely loved the last album. I really did, and I stand by that, like I said. But this album is just a huge step down, and maybe even lets me see why people were disappointed with the last album. I can sort of see where they're coming from when I hear this album, and I can hear the hints of maybe some places where people wouldn't have liked the last album, although I think this one is just far worse. I don't see how people can say this one is better, and most people are saying that this one is worse. And if you thought that Architects was being too accessible on the last album, being too rock or radio friendly, then this album is going to disappoint you even more on that regard, because they lean almost entirely into the accessible side on this album, the more radio rock flair, and I would say for not a good reason. And I still debate that on their last album that it wasn't like crazy radio friendly. I think they did a lot of creative things on it, and they still incorporated some screams and metalcore elements. Those elements are almost entirely gone on this album outside of a few times, and I think the album suffers for it. I think it becomes incredibly boring. I think it begins on a very underwhelming note with Deep Fake, which is a track that I just can't get behind at all. I don't understand why this is a single. It doesn't really leave much of an impact in any way. The guitar work is super bland in my opinion, and it opens the album on a pretty weak note. And we get even weaker when we go into Tear Gas, which I hate to say, but this is one of my least favorite songs of the year, and probably Architects' worst song to me. I cannot stand this cut in any way. The industrial guitar work, if you could even call it that, is boring and dime a dozen. It does not work and feels just very basic and very chug-along, very generic, not something that I would ever associate with Architects, especially early Architects. And the lyrics are really bad on this cut. It feels like it's trying to be this inspiring anthemic cut, and it just doesn't come across when they say, we can be unstoppable, we're invincible, all these generic anthem rock ideas that have been said to death so many times now. Sam Carter's vocals are surprisingly bad on this song too. I really don't like his cleans in the verses, specifically. They really grate on me. And sadly, that can be said for a lot of songs on this album. I feel like his vocals just aren't great throughout this album, whereas I found his cleans to be a charm on the last album, even beautiful in places like Dead Butterflies. On here, they just suffer. I don't know what happened between albums. I just think that he doesn't fit against this particular soundscape. He needs some more rougher guitar work behind him, or some orchestral elements like they had on their last album. His voice just does not fit against the guitar work on this album, I don't think, overall. And that is the case again on Spit the Bone, which I think is Sam's worst vocal performance on the album. I'll stop being negative for a second and talk about the songs that I do like. I think the lead single, When We Were Young, is still a pretty solid track. It definitely does feel more in line with their last album, probably the closest to being at least of the quality of their last album, or one of the closest on this album. And I like how the song just stays consistently energetic and consistently interesting, and I think Doom Scrolling is by far the strongest track on here. They're at least trying something new on this song and incorporating some sort of almost electronics that work well in the song as well. And this song sort of introduces a theme that I do think is pervading on the album, of how one of the things of our human condition these days is that we seem to enjoy looking through tragedy, or we seem to quote-unquote enjoy or be more obsessed with tragedy than we do with being optimistic. Burn Down My House, that's the case for that song too, and it is a more ballad cut. I don't think it works pretty well. I like what it's going for. A New Moral Low Ground is probably the catchiest cut on the album, and I think the one time that the radio rock sound actually works to Architect's benefit. It is a pretty fun cut, and I like what it does throughout the song. I think the guitar work is pretty solid. Another theme that we're going to be talking about here on Architect's album that they talk about is addressing the people who had criticisms of them changing their sound. There are a couple places where they do this on here, and they're trying to tie this into the theme of people liking to stay miserable and not changing. And I think they're implying that people want Architects to stay miserable, like on Holy Hell or All Our Gods Have Abandoned Us, rather than becoming more optimistic, because that is our human condition. But I feel like that's a really weak and strawman-like way to address people's criticisms, even though I don't necessarily agree with people who say that they didn't like Architect's new sound on their last album. I still think that's a really bad way to view the criticism, is that people want Architects to stay miserable and sad all the time. This is definitely the case on All the Love in the World, which feels like a very whiny cut in my opinion in the way that it's addressing fans, and I think it's just sort of a bad response to all the criticism. That sort of happens on Be Very Afraid too, but it's sort of ironic that they criticize fans for wanting them to go back to their old sound, when on the last cut, they go back to that old sound, almost giving in to the fans who want them to do that. So it's sort of funny that they do that and sort of destroy their own message that they had throughout the whole album. Living Is Killing Us is a pretty underwhelming cut, and I really think that Born Again Pessimist is a bad cut as well. And overall, this album is just incredibly underwhelming to me. I wish I had more to say about it besides boring, but that's really the main word that comes to mind when I hear this album. There's just nothing that really impresses me too much, besides maybe Doom Scrolling and A New Moral Low Ground. There's not much I would return to, sadly. 2.5 out of 5 stars for me. Next, let's talk about Slipknot's newest album, The End So Far. I know this album has been out for a little while, but I did want to talk about it as someone who is a fairly big Slipknot fan. And I know this album was a little bit controversial. I do think this one is a pretty big step down from their last album, but at the same time, I do not think it's a bad album, really, not at all. I actually quite enjoy it. It does feel like a sort of greatest hits album in some ways, in that it is doing sounds from all their past albums, and that might be why they call it The End So Far, is that they're looking back at their career and what they have accomplished, and they're trying to create a compilation of all their biggest moments from their career in new songs. And I did criticize the Muse album earlier this year for doing something sort of similar, for being a greatest hits type of album, but this album does feel at least a little bit more cohesive, and it still has some moments that do feel genuinely powerful and like they're actually having something to say. I think this is a case on something like Adderall, which is a really cool sound for Slipknot. I think it opens the album on a pretty interesting note. Almost has some Radiohead vibes to it, which is pretty cool, and I like Corey Taylor's vocals on this. And the Dying song, Time to Sing, while this song is admittedly a little basic for Slipknot, I do think that it works well enough for what it is. And I think it has grown on me for the first time I heard it, because I was a little underwhelmed when I first heard this song, but I do like it more now, and I think Corey Taylor's signature scream raps work pretty well. Again, is a song I'm a huge fan of, probably because it reminds me of cuts off my favorite Slipknot album, which is Volume 3. And it is a song about an addictive love. It really reminds me of Vermilion a lot in many ways, specifically Vermilion Part 2, and that it feels like a forbidden love too, like something very dark and eerie, and I think it works in that regard. And then we've got Hive Mind, which is just, I mean, wow, what an awesome song. This is probably my favorite cut on the album. It just has so much energy in it, and it feels like sort of like a song like Pulse of the Maggots, where it is about the fan base, about the concert experience as well, and I think this song will certainly go off in a live setting. Desaad is also a pretty cool song. Has another interesting continuation of sort of the sound that Slipknot was going for on some of their songs in their last album. I like that they had some sounds like that in here too. Also, Heirloom was a really nice cut for me, especially as someone who has been missing Stone Sour's songs, which is one of Corey Taylor's side projects. This one definitely feels so Stone Sour, and I really liked that it had just this more really pumping rock vibe to it. Slipknot even has some tributes to their older albums, which is with a song like H377, which is obviously meant to sort of say hell, and it feels like something off their first album, which is sort of awesome. Now, there are some weaker moments on this album. I think for as much as I appreciate what Medicine for the Dead is trying to do, it doesn't really work for me in that it feels like a bit of a messy blues type of song. Warranty is super cheesy in my opinion in what it's saying, and the sort of puns it uses doesn't work for me. And I think the finale isn't the most interesting way to end the album either. But it is nice to see that Slipknot is still just a consistent band who is still trying to do new things, and they do have a lot of new ideas on this album that I appreciate, whilst doing some stuff to tribute to their old albums, particularly Volume 3. This has a lot of Volume 3 type stuff in it, which I do appreciate as someone who thinks that is Slipknot's best album still. But it is a bit of a mess. The songs don't necessarily flow together. There's not one consistent thematic arc throughout it, but I do think that each song at least has something to say or something interesting to talk about, so I'm going to give this a solid 3.5 out of 5 stars. As a big fan of Slipknot, it was hard not to enjoy this album. Next, let's talk about Dayseeker's newest album, Dark Sun, which is one of the more recent albums I'm going to be talking about as it came out in November when this video is being published. And I was really looking forward to this album, definitely one of my most anticipated of the year, especially as someone who was a huge fan of Sleep Talk. I would also say that that is the album that catapulted Dayseeker into more popularity, and deservedly so, because I think the album is masterfully done. Sleep Talk, the title track, is still a song that I am absolutely addicted to. I think it is just such a good rock song in general, and the way they use electronics in the song is genius. It's also just one of the best breakup songs I've ever heard. So I was really looking forward to Dark Sun, especially when I heard songs like Neon Grave, which was just superb, and a very heartfelt song about Rory losing his dad to cancer. It was a very hard song to listen to in some ways about that loss, but it was very powerful, and Without Me fared even better for me. It's once again a breakup song, and for some reason Dayseeker just do breakup songs so well. And I'll talk about Without Me more in a little bit, but needless to say, I was very excited for this album with those two very strong lead singles. And thankfully, the album as a whole just absolutely delivers to me, in my opinion. Now, if you're someone who enjoys Dayseeker's more metalcore stuff, then I would say to keep an open mind, because this album does ditch those metalcore influences almost entirely besides 2 songs, and it goes for a much more synthwave vibe throughout the whole album, very poppy in some places too. Dayseeker do this sound incredibly well. I think it's very tastefully done, and it doesn't feel cheap at all. It works very well, especially given the thematic subject matter, as Rory is addressing both life and death on this album, the passing of his father as well as the birth of his daughter. And I think the album titled Dark Sun is sort of a perfect culmination of that, as he's looking at the dark sides of life, of him having to deal with the loss of his father, as well as maybe losing some other loved ones through breakups or other types of things, but he's also looking at hope through the birth of his daughter as well. The album opens on Dream State, which is a superb way to establish the album and talk about Rory's desire to almost just sort of abandon the tragedies of the world or to ignore them and instead try to live in a dreamlike state and just sort of ignore it, but he knows he can't. And I think the song works very well in establishing that, and I think it's a good way to begin the album on a more comfortable note for transitioning fans into Dayseeker's new sound. And this one and Neon Grave are definitely the two that feel most like they could belong on Sleep Talk, so I think it was a smart move for Dayseeker to begin off with those two songs that are more in line of what fans were initially expecting. But with Without Me, they do finally transition into their newer sound, and oh my gosh, Without Me is one of my favorite songs of the year, probably a top 5 contender for me if I'm being honest. This song is just gorgeous. My goodness, it is so beautiful. I love how the sound just sort of fades out into a beautiful atmosphere in the chorus. The first time, just letting Roy's vocals breathe before going into this drop that is just so hard to resist. It is beautifully done. And while it is sort of simple what this song is doing, I think it just does it so well that I can't deny it. And I really love that in the second iteration of the chorus, they go more intense, and the guitars and drum work come in. It's just a really good progression, and then the soft and the more intense combine in the last iteration of the chorus. This song just is masterful from front to back, and definitely my favorite on the album. It works so well. So it was going to be a high order to beat this song after this, but while other songs didn't beat out Without Me, I think there's still plenty of highlights to talk about on this album. Homesick is definitely the most pop that this album goes, but I think it works, and I think it's pretty dang catchy. It has some sort of EDM vibes into it, which come into even greater fruition on the song Dark Sun, the title track. This song is just full-on EDM, especially in the drop, which is so much fun. And I think the song works as that sort of idea of looking for hope in darkness, because it has that sort of tentatively happy feel in the drop. Like, the drop has some dark tinges to it too, some implied darkness in there, which I think is very clever to do musically. I think it works very well for the song. Paper Heart is an absolute tearjerker. It is about Rory's mental health, or he could be going into the perspective of another person, as he often does. And I mean, the chorus is just mind-blowingly ethereal and gorgeous. It's simplistic. It reminds me of Already Numb in that it's just a simple electronic background along with an acoustic guitar and just Rory's vocals just sounding so great. And I think the message of the song comes through loud and clear because of that, and it's just a beautiful culmination on the struggles of going through mental health issues. And then the closing 2 tracks. I mean, wow, this album ends so well and so cleverly as well because Parallel addresses Roy's dad's death like Neon Grave does, and I think it does it on a much more heartfelt level, and it also does go a little more hopeful than Neon Grave does, in my opinion. While I like Neon Grave better, I do think I like that Parallel has this more hopeful vibe to it, as Rory talks about the afterlife as almost a world in parallel to ours, and the way it transitions effortlessly into Afterglow, Hazel's song, is awesome. And Afterglow was the perfect way to end this album. It is the most big feeling song on the album, brings the guitar back after the more softer synth flourishes of the last song, and it brings the hope, it brings the sun that the album talks about in Rory's daughter Hazel, and it is such a sweet song in that way, as Rory talks about his daughter as being the best thing that he has ever done. It is just so beautiful, and you can feel the love for his daughter here, as well as his renewed hope in life because of her. I just love the human connection on this song and how the musicality reflects that. It really just brings the album home in a wonderful way that really did bring tears to my eyes the first time I heard it, because it was just so well done and so cathartic. I am someone who is actually okay with them becoming more accessible. If they went full on just poppy, like even abandoning the synth flourishes or even abandoning the some metalcore elements they had on this album, I would not complain, to be honest, because I think Dayseeker has the chops to do it, as they prove on this album time and time again. The only songs on this album that don't necessarily stand out to me, and they're not even terrible, I would say Quicksand is probably the weakest on the album. It just feels a little repetitive, and while I like the featured vocalist on here, the song doesn't really do much to leave an impact on me, and it's sort of a song that just comes and goes, especially following Dark Sun. And I think Crying While You're Dancing thematically doesn't fit quite as well on the album. It is a breakup song like Without Me, but it doesn't have the same emotional impact as Without Me, in my opinion. It's not a bad song, once again, but it's not one that stands out to me quite as much. Still, all in all, this is an excellent, nearly pitch-perfect album in what it does, and it's definitely going to be one of my top 10 of the year. It would take a lot for albums to beat this out in the top 10 spots. 4.5 out of 5 stars for this one. I highly recommend it. Next, let's talk about Fit for a King's newest album, The Hell We Create. Another one that was very anticipated for me, as someone who thinks Fit for a King has proven to be just a really consistent and excellent metalcore band. Now, The Path was an album that I wasn't necessarily the most impressed by, as a lot of Fit for a King fans weren't, and if anything, it has shrunk on me with time. This album is decidedly darker than The Path, especially because it is delving into some very personal issues that Ryan Kirby has gone through. This is definitely Fit for a King's most personal album in general, I think. It is addressing much more personal things, and I think it really works for that reason. I think this is a really great Fit for a King album, and while they're maybe staying in relatively safe territory, there are places where they try new things that I think work pretty dang well. I think the title track and Opening Up Things establishes the thematic arc of this album pretty good, and that is that we often create hells of our own making, that we do it through our actions and through the decisions we make. They continue to delve into this on In the Other Side, which is one of my favorites on the album for sure. I love the guitar work on this album, on this song. It's probably some of the best guitar work on the album as a whole, and Ryan's cleans in this are some of his best. The song has a very desperate feel, which I think is fitting because it is about Ryan's wife having a stroke and how he almost lost her to this thing, and I like that he is very vulnerable about that. And then there is just the ending that feels positively apocalyptic, and I feel like musically it's supposed to represent the end of the world feeling that Ryan was feeling when he thought his wife was going to pass. I think it works very well conceptually in that regard. Falling Through the Sky is a pretty catchy cut. I like that it dedicates to its more hard rock, radio ready vibe. It is one of the more accessible songs of Fit for a King's career, but unlike Locked in My Head from The Path, for an example, which was also radio rock, I think this song nails that sound a little better, as the guitars have a little bit more grit behind them, and I think the song has a bit more to say as well. Reaper is superb. I think it is definitely the backbreaker of this album. It is a hype-up song in many ways, although it has some very dark content matter of everyday feeling like he's on death row, as Ryan says, and like the world is coming to an end. And like In the Other Side, it does have sort of an apocalyptic feel to it that I really like. And if you like intense Fit for a King, then you're going to love the ending parts of this song because, man, it really goes there. And Ryan lets some of his most guttural screams out. It is awesome. Eyes Roll Back. It's even more intense, and besides Shattered Glass, this might be Fit for a King's most intense song. There are some places where I would debate it is their most intense. It even brings to mind The Lioness for me, which is one of my favorite Fit for a King songs, so I say that as a compliment. It feels very foreboding and eerie and dark. It could fit on Creation Destruction, in my opinion, which I would say is still Fit for a King's darkest feeling album atmospherically, and this song has that atmosphere to it. It feels positively chilling in what it does, and Ryan's screams are just menacing. The last 3 songs on this album all sort of come and blend together in a way, and I say that as a good thing because they're all about Ryan's family, specifically his nieces and niece and nephew that he had adopted from their two parents who were very abusive to them, apparently. And he's making these songs almost from their perspective, as well as him and his wife's perspective, about how the family that these two were a part of created a hell for them that they felt like they couldn't escape. Fracture goes into the perspective of the kids, which I really like, and the chorus is pretty simplistic in that all it says is, "I don't need you in my life," but the way that those lyrics are sung out by Ryan makes you feel like convinced by their conviction. It feels positively euphoric for him to sing these words out, and I like that he's doing this for his niece and nephew and reaching out. This is probably my favorite song on the album, honestly, and it has Tuck O'Leary as the clean vocalist, which was a great choice in my opinion. I wish they used Tuck more. This song shows once again that I think he should have more vocal moments in Fit for a King's discography. As much as I do respect that Brian has improved his cleans, and I like his cleans, I just like Tuck's a little better personally, and this song, his vocals are just wonderful. And I like that the song is about Ryan and his wife sort of comforting the kids and showing them that they'll take them through these painful and traumatic events that they've gone through, and they'll be a soft hand for them, a helping hand for them, and that they're reaching out for them to be a part of their lives. And then the album ends with What You Left Behind, which is a pretty vicious and epic song with some orchestral elements in it that I really like. I'm not sure if this is quite a strong closer as Oblivion, but it comes pretty dang close as it takes the parents of these abused kids to task in a pretty powerful way that leaves you with cold chills. And I think it ends the album off on a pretty great note. This is a pretty consistent album from front to back in terms of what it does, and I really enjoy it. The only cuts that I would say I'm not as huge fans of is Times Like This, which I just don't think fits on this album at all because it doesn't feel as personal and is a more politically leaning song. And honestly, if you're wanting to hear a more politically leaning song about this idea that our divide is growing and that politics are becoming more and more just vicious, then listen to The Price of Agony, which I think addresses that a lot better in terms of Fit for a King songs about that subject matter. And Sink Below is fine, but I do think it's a little generic. But overall, this is a great Fit for a King album. I think returned back to great form after The Path, and it's one that I've already returned to several times, and I'm sure I will continue to do so. Strong 4 out of 5 stars for me. And finally, let's end on Exile by Demon Hunter, yet another anticipated release of mine. As you can see, October and the beginning of November have been pretty big for me in terms of albums I've been looking forward to, and this was another one of them. I would still say that Demon Hunter is one of my favorite metal bands, although While She Sleeps has probably replaced them as my favorite metalcore band at this point. I still have a lot to owe Demon Hunter to. They were the band that got me into metalcore. They were my foray into more intense music, and I am really grateful to them for that. I honestly don't think they have a bad album at all. Their weakest to me is Summer of Darkness, and even that album I think is good. I do think in recent years they've become maybe a little bit more weaker, as they have been not quite as interesting as they used to be, but that's not to say they've become terrible by any means. I think Outlive was a fine album, and I think that War and Peace both worked pretty well, and I think Exile very much so follows more in the path of peace than it does war, in that it is going a more softer route for Demon Hunter, and I don't know if I necessarily love that they go the entirely soft route here, because there are places where it doesn't work, and also sadly, there are some places where this album leaves a sour taste in my mouth, which I'll get into why. I do think this album gets off to a very solid and even pretty dang strong start with the first 4 tracks. Defense Mechanism is excellent. It is a classic hype-up Demon Hunter song, and Max Cavalera's vocals on this are awesome. You can feel the vicious attack in this song, and the guitar work is awesome. It really gets things off to a very strong note. And then Master comes in, which is a very new sound for Demon Hunter. It feels like it's sort of bringing in the electronics that Demon Hunter introduced on Peace, as well as the sound that Ryan Clark was attacking with his side project Knives that he was doing. And it amps it up with some guitar work that is just explosive and works so well. And I like that the song is about, like, the idea that some people are bowing to new masters as opposed to God, which is something very typical of Demon Hunter. Silence the World is a social media song, and sometimes I do find social media songs tiring where the message is social media is bad, but I think this song works in that it addresses it from a more emotional perspective, and that sometimes we do need to abandon the negativity of social media and instead focus on what is in front of us, and that we need to sort of metaphorically silence the world and just go back to the basics. I think it works well, and I think that Tom England is an excellent feature here. His voice is beautiful and works very well with Ryan Clark's. The song is 7 minutes long, but I don't think it's boring. I think it works well. And Heaven Don't Cry is a pretty interesting cut in that it is a sort of expressing some despair for people who have not accepted Christ into their lives. But I like that the song is saying that there will be a time, there's at least hope expressed that there will be a time when that will happen. I think Praise the Void is gorgeous as well. We've heard the song before on Songs of Death and Resurrection, and now we're hearing it in its non-acoustic form, and I think it works very well in context of this album. It is a really good Demon Hunter ballad, and I like that vocally the song is very monotone, which goes with this idea that we're praising things that we shouldn't be, we're idolizing things that we shouldn't be, and it's making us sort of mindless drones in a way. Chemicals is also a pretty good cut, although I wish it was a little more energetic than it is, as it is expressing despair of someone losing themselves to drug addiction, and I feel like the song should maybe be a little more emotional, but I do like what it's doing, and I do think it's an interesting new direction for Demon Hunter. Devotion is pretty much a classic Demon Hunter cut. It even feels like old Demon Hunter to me. It does sound like Ryan's straining a little bit in the chorus with these falsettos, but I do overall like the song, and I like the intense screams that come back. Because overall, this album is actually fairly accessible for Demon Hunter. Even though they are trying new things, it does feel like their most radio-ready album in places. Sadly, unlike some other Demon Hunter songs, I feel like the length is not necessarily earned across this album. I think some songs come across as incredibly boring, sadly, and there's definitely places in this album where songs fade into one another, and even production-wise, this album is kind of weak. I feel like Ryan's vocals fade into the background sometimes over the guitars that can be a little too loud, and the reason that this album does leave a bad taste in my mouth in some places is that some of the politics that Demon Hunter is saying here just feel like just not well expressed in my opinion, and just very whiny and very typical conservative Christian politics that I just do not care about. Freedom is Dead is a huge example of this. I wish I liked this song more because it is one of the more upbeat songs on the album, but it is also pretty generic, and the guitar work is some of the most uninspired on the album. And also, just, it feels like paranoid delusions that Demon Hunter is saying this stuff like Christians are losing their freedom in the modern world. I just simply do not agree with this at all. I think Christians are fine, specifically in America. I do not think we're at any risk of losing our freedom, and it feels very hyperbolic to me at the end of the day. It feels like something that's very paranoid, and I wish that Demon Hunter didn't have a song like this on the album, because I think it reflects badly on them. Another example of this is Revolutions, which just feels like a song that's throwing its hands up and saying that ultimately protest and trying to make change in the world is ineffective. It doesn't really do anything. And I just simply disagree with that. And I don't really like that message. Godless features a guitarist of Judas Priest, and you would think the song would have more rocking sensibilities, but it is one of the most plodding songs on the album, I am sad to say. I wish it had more interesting going on, and it has a very typical message to it. It's about exactly what you would think it would be about based on the title, and I just don't really feel like it has much desperation to it that the band is wanting it to have. It just doesn't feel like it earns that. Along the Way is sadly a very uninteresting way to end the album. It's the longest song that Demon Hunter has made, and I don't think it earns that length as it is just repetitive throughout. Another Place is another song that just feels sort of inactive, and I don't feel like it lines up with Christian philosophy, this idea that Ryan would rather abandon the world and leave it behind than save it. Those aspects of the album do sadly weigh it down a fair bit. The weak production, the songs that just sort of blend into one another, and the sometimes yikes politics that can emerge. It's not as infuriating as Shinedown's album, in my opinion, as usually Demon Hunter has more to say on this album than Shinedown did on theirs, but it's weird that I can sort of compare those albums in terms of an album that sort of disappointed me because of some of the ideas that popped up on it. Thankfully, on this album, it isn't as obnoxious, and it's something that I think can be overall overlooked because there are some really good moments on this album. But I do still find this album a little underwhelming, and probably Demon Hunter's worst album, even worse than Summer of Darkness, which I've always considered to be Demon Hunter's weakest. But I do think this one comes out on top as probably their weakest, because it just doesn't work overall, and I think the concept is pretty weak. 3 out of 5 stars for me. So yeah, that ends this episode of Quick Album Reviews. What were your thoughts on any of the albums I talked about? Let me know in the comments down below. And once again, my name is James. I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece on this channel. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, then I'd once again appreciate it if you left a like on this video and subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. And until then, I will see you all in the next video.